Good morning, everyone. The 9,010th meeting of the Security Council is called to order. I give the floor to the Russian Federation.
Председатель, прежде чем мы дойдем до утверждения повестки дня, хотел бы выразить протест в связи с тем, что только что начавшееся британское председательство обошлось с двумя нашими запросами на созыв заседания Совета Безопасности в связи с ужасающей провокацией украинских радикалов в городе Буча. С начала регулярного, который мы запросили в воскресенье 3 апреля на 15:00 4 апреля, в понедельник, а потом и экстренного, который мы запросили в 12 часов 4 апреля, после того, как вы нам отказали. Мы сочли возможным пойти на вопиющее, вы сочли возможным пойти на вопиющее нарушение правил процедуры Совета и проигнорировать наш запрос, и во второй раз вынеся авторитарное и ни с кем не согласованное решение о том, что эту тему лучше было бы обсудить сегодня. Это возмутительная ситуация, изложена в моем вчерашнем письме на ваше имя, которое мы распространили в качестве официального документа Совета. Я бы хотел спросить вас, на каком основании вы позволяете себе действовать столь неслыханным образом, презрев любые нормы и правила? Разве вы не знаете, что в случае вашего несогласия с нашим предложением вам следовало созвать заседание и вынести вопрос о целесообразности его проведения на процедурное голосование? Тем более, что у вас должен был быть перед глазами пример нашего председательства, когда мы ни разу не отказали ни в проведении любого из 6 заседаний по Украине. Мы требуем от вас разъяснений и гарантий того, что в будущем вы не будете оспаривать право членов Совета Безопасности запрашивать заседания, зафиксированные в правиле 2 правил процедуры Совета. Напомню его по-английски. The President shall call a meeting of the Security Council at the request of any member of the Security Council. Благодарю вас.
I thank the representative of the Russian Federation. Is there anyone else who wants to comment on this? I will explain the presidency's position in just a moment. Okay. If I could respond to your points from the Russian Federation, we did not reject your request for a meeting. We received your letter on Sunday, and it is the responsibility, the obligation of the presidency to schedule a meeting. You particularly requested a meeting for a time on Monday. Our proposal as presidency was to schedule the meeting either alongside the meeting today, so well within the 48-hour limit, which is the convention of the Security Council, or to hold the meetings sequentially, one after the other. And I understand that the Russian Federation turned down both proposals, but I wish to be clear that we did not reject the request for a meeting. The deferral proposed was less than 24 hours, and to be clear, we share the view that this is an urgent situation, and we have, as I say, offered the Russian Federation either a separate meeting today or to combine it with this one. And so, as far as the presidency is concerned, we did everything in line with the provisional rules of procedure and with precedent. We have received no other complaints from council members on the subject. I give the floor to the Russian Federation.
Благодарю вас. У нас есть доказательства, фактические доказательства того, что это было не менее чем за 24 часа до заседания, которое мы просили провести. Это все зафиксировано документально. Если это кому-то интересно, мы готовы это представить. Но я хочу выразить надежду, что то, что вы сейчас сказали, означает, что вы не будете впредь отказывать странам-членам Совета Безопасности в проведении встреч когда они этого запросят. Благодарю вас.
I thank the representative of the Russian Federation. The presidency will not refuse to host meetings in the future, and I hope that that now closes that point and we can proceed with the adoption of the agenda. The provisional agenda for this meeting is letter dated the 28th of February 2014 from the permanent representative of Ukraine to the United Nations, addressed to the President of the Security Council, S/2014/136. The agenda is adopted. I should like to start by taking the opportunity to pay tribute on behalf of this Council to Her Excellency Lana Naseba, the permanent representative of the United Arab Emirates, for your service as the President of the Council for the month of March. I'm sure I speak for all of us in expressing our deep appreciation to Ambassador Naseba and her team for the skillful conduct of the Council's business last month. Thank you very much indeed to your team. In accordance with Rule 37 of the Council's Provisional Rules of Procedure, I invite the representative of Ukraine to participate in this meeting. It is so decided. On behalf of the Council, I welcome the participation of His Excellency Mr. Volodymyr Zelensky, the President of Ukraine, and just add that, as usual precedent, the permanent representative of Ukraine will also join the meeting in case of any technical issues. In accordance with Rule 39 of the Council's Provisional Rules of Procedure, I invite the following briefers to participate in this meeting. Ms. Rosemary DiCarlo, Under-Secretary General for Political and Peacebuilding Affairs, and Mr. Martin Griffiths, Under-Secretary General for Humanitarian Affairs, Emergency Relief Coordinator. It is so decided. In accordance with Rule 39 of the Council's Provisional Rules of Procedure, I also invite His Excellency Mr. Olof Skog, Head of Delegation of the European Union to the United Nations, to participate in this meeting. It is so decided. The Security Council will now begin its consideration of item 2 of the agenda. I wish to warmly welcome His Excellency the Secretary General, His Excellency Mr. Antonio Guterres, and I give him the floor.
Madam President, Excellencies, the war in Ukraine is one of the greatest challenges ever to the international order and the global peace architecture founded on the United Nations Charter, because of its nature, intensity, and consequences. We are dealing with the full-fledged invasion on several fronts of one member state of the United Nations, Ukraine, by another, the Russian Federation, a permanent member of the Security Council, in violation of the United Nations Charter, and with several aims, including redrawing the internationally recognized borders between the two countries. The war, and I'm also deeply shocked by the personal testimony of rapes and sexual violence that now are emerging. The High Commissioner for Human Rights has spoken of possible war crimes, grave breaches of international humanitarian law, and serious violations of international human rights law. And the Russian offensive has also led to the displacement of more than 10 million people in just 1 month, the fastest forced population movement since the Second World War. Far beyond Ukraine's borders, the war has led to massive increases in prices of food, energy and fertilizers, because Russia and Ukraine are linchpins of these markets. It has disrupted supply chains and increased the cost of transportation, putting even more pressure on the developing world. Many developing countries are already on the verge of debt collapse due to the impact of the COVID-19 pandemic and the lack of adequate liquidity and debt relief, stemming ultimately from the unfair nature of our global economic and financial system. For all these reasons, it is more urgent by the day to silence the guns. That is why I asked the Emergency Relief Coordinator, Martin Griffiths, to travel to Russia and Ukraine to press for an urgent humanitarian ceasefire. And the Secretary-General Griffiths will update you on the humanitarian situation and the results of his contacts so far. And the Secretary-General Di Carlo will also brief you on the political and human rights dimensions. But as Secretary-General of the United Nations, it is my duty to call the attention of the Council to the serious damage being done to the global economy and particularly to vulnerable people and developing countries. Madam President, our analysis indicates that 74 developing countries with a total population of 1.2 billion people are particularly vulnerable to spiking food, energy, and fertilizer costs. Debt obligations take up some 16% of developing countries' export earnings, and in small island developing states, the figure is 34% and rising because of increased interest rates and the need to pay for expensive imports. In the past months alone, wheat prices have increased by 22%, maize by 21%, and barley by 31%. Brent oil prices on the 1st of April were more than 60% higher than at the same time last year. A series of events have led to that, not only the present situation. Natural gas and fertilizer prices more than double over the same period. We are already seeing some countries move from vulnerability into crisis and signs of serious social unrest. The flames of conflict are fueled by inequality, deprivation, and underfunding. With all the warning signals flashing red, we have a duty to act. Madam President, the Global Crisis Response Group on Food, Energy and Finance that I set up last month has formulated some initial recommendations for the consideration of Member States, international financial institutions, and others. On food, we are urging all countries to keep markets open, resist unjustified and unnecessary export restrictions, and make reserves available to countries at risk of hunger and famine. This is not the time for protectionism. Humanitarian appeals must be fully funded. People caught up in crisis around the world cannot pay the price for this war. On energy, the use of strategic stockpiles and additional reserves could help ease this energy crisis in the short term. But the only medium and long-term solution is to accelerate the deployment of renewable energy, which is not impacted by market fluctuations. These will allow the progressive phase-out of coal and other fossil fuels, and renewables are already cheaper in most of the cases. And on finance, international financial institutions must go into emergency mode. We need urgent action by the G20 and international financial institutions to increase liquidity and fiscal space so that governments can provide safety nets for the poorest and most vulnerable. The reform I've been calling for the global financial system is long overdue. All these actions are closely linked with the prevention agenda and with building and sustaining peace. Madam President, the war in Ukraine must stop now. We need serious negotiations for peace based on the principles of the United Nations Charter. This Council is charged with maintaining peace and doing so in solidarity. I deeply regret the divisions that have prevented the Security Council from acting not only on Ukraine, but on other threats to peace and security around the world. I urge the Council to do everything in its power to end the war and to mitigate its impact, both on the suffering people of Ukraine and on vulnerable people and developing countries around the world, and I thank you.
I thank the Secretary-General for his remarks. I now give the floor to Ms. Rosemary DiCarlo.
Thank you. Madam President, since I last briefed this Council on 17 March, the security situation in Ukraine has seriously deteriorated. The number of Ukrainian civilians killed has more than doubled. Ukrainian cities continue to be mercilessly pounded, often indiscriminately, by heavy artillery and aerial bombardments. and hundreds of thousands of people, including children, the elderly, and the disabled, remain trapped in encircled areas under nightmarish conditions. The devastation wrought on Mariupol and other Ukrainian cities is one of the shameful hallmarks of this senseless war. The horror deepened this past weekend as shocking images emerged of dead civilians, some with hands bound, lying in the streets of Bucha, the town near Kiev formerly held by Russian forces. Many bodies were also found in a mass grave in the same locality. Reports by non-governmental organizations and media also allege summary executions of civilians, rape and looting in Chernihiv, Kharkiv, and Kiev regions. Madam President, away from the fighting, diplomatic efforts to end this war, including direct talks between Ukrainian and Russian representatives, have continued. We commend the government of Turkey for hosting these discussions, as well as the efforts of many others engaging with Russia and Ukraine to help bring about peace. We welcome the willingness of the sides to continue engaging to reach a mutual understanding. This requires good faith and earnest efforts, and progress in the negotiations should be translated quickly into action on the ground. While there has been a reported reduction of Russian troops in attacks around Kiev and Chernihiv, such moves should not be merely tactical, repositioning forces for renewed attacks on Ukrainian cities and towns elsewhere. The General Assembly has twice called for Russian forces to withdraw entirely from Ukrainian territory and cease all military operations. We also take note of the reported withdrawal of Russian forces from around the Chernobyl nuclear site. The International Atomic Energy Agency reports that this development will hopefully allow it to conduct an assistance and support mission to provide technical advice and to deliver equipment where necessary as soon as possible. All nuclear sites in Ukraine must be fully protected and secured. Military operations in or around these locations must be avoided. Madam President, the numbers tell a tragic, if yet incomplete, story. According to the Office of the High Commissioner for Human Rights, at least 1,480 civilians have been killed and at least 2,195 injured between 24 February and 4 April 2022. OHCHR believes that the actual figures are considerably higher. We are gravely concerned by the persistent use of explosive weapons with the wide impact area in or near populated areas. Such weapons are causing most civilian casualties, as well as massive destruction of civilian infrastructure, including residential buildings, hospitals, schools, water stations, and electricity systems. OHCHR has received credible allegations that Russian forces have used cluster munitions in populated areas at least 24 times. Allegations that Ukrainian forces have used such weapons are also being investigated. As noted by the High Commissioner, indiscriminate attacks are prohibited under international humanitarian law and may amount to war crimes. The massive destruction of civilian objects and the high number of civilian casualties strongly indicate that the fundamental principles of distinction, proportionality, and precaution have not been sufficiently adhered to. In besieged cities, a significant increase in mortality rates among civilians can also be attributed to the disruption of medical care and basic services. People with disabilities and the elderly are particularly vulnerable. As of 4 April 2022, the World Health Organization has reported a total of 85 attacks on healthcare facilities, resulting in at least 72 fatalities and 43 injuries. Madam President, we are seriously concerned about reports of cases of arbitrary arrests and enforced disappearances of persons who have been vocal against the Russian invasion. As of 30 March, OHCHR has documented the arbitrary detention and possible enforced disappearance of 22 journalists and civil society members in Kiev, Kherson, Luhansk, and Zaporizhia regions. 24 local officials have also been detained in regions under Russian control, 13 of whom have been subsequently released. We call for the immediate release of all individuals who have been arbitrarily detained, including journalists, local officials, civil society activists, and others. Also, as of 30 March, OHCHR has recorded 7 journalists and media workers killed since hostilities began. Another 15 have come under armed attack, 9 of whom were injured. Allegations of conflict-related sexual violence perpetrated by Russian forces have also emerged. These include gang rape and rapes in front of children. There are also claims of sexual violence by Ukrainian forces and civil defense militias. The UN Human Rights Monitoring Mission in Ukraine continues to seek to verify all these allegations. We're also concerned about disturbing videos depicting abuse of prisoners of war on both sides. All prisoners of war must be treated with dignity and full respect for their rights in accordance with international humanitarian law. Madam President, the many credible allegations of serious violations of international humanitarian law and international human rights law from areas recently retaken from Russian forces must not go unanswered. We support efforts to examine these allegations and to gather evidence. Ensuring accountability and justice for acts committed during the war will not be easy, but it is essential. Madam President, we are heartened by the generosity of neighboring countries who have accepted millions of refugees and the solidarity of the Ukrainian people who are hosting their displaced compatriots. With more than 10 million people displaced either within Ukraine or abroad as refugees, roughly 1/4 of the population, the United Nations is gravely concerned about the heightened risk of human trafficking. Indeed, suspected and verified cases of human trafficking are surfacing in the surrounding countries, according to the International Organization for Migration. Madam President, this war is devastating Ukraine now, but it also threatens its future. Early assessment projections by UNDP suggest that if the war continues through 2022, Ukraine faces the prospect of seeing 18 years of socioeconomic progress lost. This would set the country and the region back decades and leave deep long-term social and economic fissures. UN agencies, including UNDP, are working to help preserve Ukraine's hard-won development gains. This involves supporting the government to sustain essential government structures and basic services, including emergency measures to sustain livelihoods, such as cash-based assistance. Madam President, the war in Ukraine has damaged Europe's security architecture. Its economic repercussions are already evident far from the battlefield. The longer the war continues, the greater the risk that it will further weaken the global institutions and mechanisms dedicated to preserve peace and security. The war was started by choice. There is no inevitability to it or to the suffering it is causing. The United Nations is ready to do everything within its means to help bring an end to it. Thank you, Madam President.
I thank Mr. Carlo for her briefing. And I now give the floor to Mr. Martin Griffiths.
Thank you, Madam President. As you've just heard from the Secretary General and Under Secretary General De Carlo, Ukrainian civilians are paying far too high a price for this war. I want to speak briefly about humanitarian needs and what we're doing to meet them before I then refer to my recent travels. In the last 6 weeks, as we have heard, at least 1,430 people have been killed, among them over 121 children, and we know this is very likely a serious underestimate. Homes and civilian infrastructure, bridges, hospitals, schools have been damaged and destroyed. And in fact, the current figures on displacement tell us that more than 11.3 million people have now been forced to flee their homes, and of that, 4.2 million are now refugees. in those generous neighboring countries that Rosemary has just been referring to. So in total, more than a quarter of the population of Ukraine has fled in this extraordinary short time. And unfortunately, we can imagine that these figures will continue to rise until we can find a pause and some peace. Madam President, the ground and air offensives and counteroffensives are making life nearly impossible for many civilians in Ukraine. Families, the elderly, women and children have been trapped by fighting already for too long. For more than 5 weeks, the people of Mariupol have been caught up in the fighting. And it is well documented that really Mariupol is a center of hell. Other cities like Chernihiv, Sumy, and Kharkiv remain cut off from essential goods and services. And perilous conditions are hampering our efforts to access civilians or for them to access us. And we restate here that civilians must be allowed to move to safer areas without the fear of attacks and at their own choice and at their own selection. It's vital that all parties to the conflict respect their obligations under international humanitarian law to protect civilians and to allow impartial humanitarian organizations safe, rapid, unimpeded access to all civilians in need wherever they are in Ukraine. Madam President, as the world watches humanitarian needs soar in Ukraine, the United Nations and our partner organizations are making every effort to dramatically increase our support to affected civilians. The work of the 6,000 volunteers from the Ukraine Red Cross, as we have noted before in this chamber, together with local NGOs in eastern Ukraine, these people, these organizations continue to work tirelessly at the front line of assistance to communities. The World Food Programme has reached more than 1.3 million people with cash and food assistance and plans to push that number up to 2.5 million people in this month. Health partners report that more than 180 tons of medical supplies were delivered in Ukraine, with another 470 tons on the way. And this will address the health needs of around 6 million people in the months ahead. And I'm pleased to say, that seems an odd word to say in the context of Ukraine, that after much effort in the past day, another convoy went from our humanitarian hub in Dnipro to the Far East. Today, food, winter clothing, non-food items, medicine, hygiene kits were offloaded to the Ukraine Red Cross and will reach the hands of those most in need. Indeed, following notification to both parties, a formal process that we and also the International Red Cross are engaged in, 4 convoys in total from the UN have provided critical support to people in some of the cities encircled by war and affected by ongoing fighting. Several more are planned. So these are initial steps, but it gives us a basis to now expand and taking our efforts up to scale and expanding much more than 1 convoy a day. As the Secretary General and the Undersecretary General has already said, I want to also join them in expressing my concern over the growing number of reports we receive of human trafficking, sexual violence, exploitation, and abuse in Ukraine and in the region. And as ever, such horrific incidents as we're seeing, they overwhelmingly impact displaced women and children more than others. We're bolstering protection and gender-based violence services through agencies to provide specialized care for survivors and through the wealth of civil society organizations in Ukraine. These services are designed, carried out directly in collaboration with and through Ukrainian civil society, including, very particularly, women-led organizations. Madam President, today I'm addressing you from Geneva, having just returned from Moscow overnight. As you know, the Secretary General, as he said, charged me to bring both sides together on humanitarian grounds to explore both specific and sustained ways to reduce humanitarian suffering, including in particular inter alia, but in particular, the pursuit of a humanitarian ceasefire. Yesterday in Moscow, I had long and frank exchanges with the Minister of Foreign Affairs, Sergei Lavrov, and his deputy, Sergei Vershinin, and then separately with Alexander Fomin, the Deputy Minister of Defense. In my meetings with these senior officials, I discussed also, in addition to these possibilities of humanitarian ceasefires, I discussed the issue of humanitarian convoys of safe passage, including the 4 which I've already referred to. I outlined possibilities for building further on that cooperation, sharing specific suggestions for mutually agreed upon military freezes to allow for evacuation of civilians and for the safe passage of life-saving aid, in effect for humanitarian pauses in different parts of Ukraine to save lives and bring back a modicum of safety for those living in those places. My counterparts in Moscow received these suggestions, assured me of their intent to carefully study those ideas, which I left with them. And we agreed to remain in close contact. And I came away from these meetings believing that we have a very long road ahead of us, but it must be traveled. And Madam President, we will travel it. Tomorrow I plan to travel to Ukraine to have discussions with senior authorities from the Ukrainian government in Kyiv on Thursday on these same issues and others that they will no doubt present to me, and also to see firsthand with our crisis coordinator, Amin Awad, the humanitarian response. Madam President, thanks to generous donor contributions, many from governments in this chamber, the humanitarian response since February has indeed been scaled up, allowing us to meet the needs of 1.5 million people. We will need sustained financial support for needs in Ukraine. And like the Secretary General, I want to stress, as he has done consistently, that funding must not be diverted from other crises. And Madam President, for Afghanistan, that is one example. And as you heard from David Beasley last week, conflict, climate shocks, COVID, compounded by the soaring food and fuel costs indicated by the Secretary General, could push another 47 million people globally into severe food insecurity. And so the total number of people around the world who will not know where their next meal comes from could be driven to the astonishing figure of 325 million people around the world. That is by a long distance the highest in our recent history, and well over double what it was 3 years ago. So, Madam President, I close, of course, like others, by reminding the Council of what the Council already knows well. The world cannot afford this war, and neither can the people of Ukraine. And like others, I call on all Council members and member states with influence to support all efforts from whatever part they come from in the pursuit of peace and the alleviation of humanitarian suffering, for the sake of the people of Ukraine, for the sake of those around the world who cannot afford to bear the additional burden this war imposes on them and all of us. We must, as the Secretary General said, silence the guns. Thank you, Madam President.
I thank Mr. Griffiths for his briefing. I now give the floor to His Excellency Mr. Volodymyr Zelensky, the President of Ukraine. You have the floor, sir.
Thank you very much, dear Madam Chairman. Dear Mr. Secretary General, distinguished members of the Security Council and other members of this meeting, thank you very much for this opportunity. I'm sure that all the representatives of the United Nations member states will hear me today. Yesterday, I returned from our city of Bucha, recently liberated from Russian troops, not far from Kyiv. So there is not a single crime that they would not commit there. The Russian military searched for and purposely purposefully killed anyone who served our country. They shot and killed women outside their houses when they just tried to call someone who is alive. They killed entire families, adults and children, and they tried to burn the bodies. I am addressing you on behalf of the people who honor the memory of the deceased every single day, in the memory of the civilians who died, who were shot and killed in the back of their head after being tortured. Some of them were shot on the streets, others were thrown into the wells, so they died there in suffering. They were killed in their apartments, houses, blowing up grenades. The civilians were crushed by tanks while sitting in their cars in the middle of the road, just for their pleasure. They cut off limbs, cut their throats, slashed their throats. Women were raped and killed in front of their children. Their tongues were pulled out only because the aggressor did not hear what they wanted to hear from them. So this is no different from other terrorists such as Daesh, who occupied some territories. And here it is done by a member of the United Nations Security Council, destroying internal unity, borders, countries, and taking the right of more than a dozen countries who are self-determined and independent. They pursue a consistent policy of destroying ethnic and religious diversity. They inflame wars and deliberately lead them in such a way that to kill as many regular civilians and cities, to leave the country where they deploy their troops in ruins and filled with mass graves. You all see that. And they support hatred at the level of the state and seek to export it to other countries through their system of propaganda and political corruption. They provoke a global food crisis that could lead to famine in Africa, Asia, and other countries, and will surely end in large-scale political chaos in many countries, and destroying their domestic security. So where is the security that the Security Council needs to guarantee? It's not there, although there is a Security Council. So where is the peace? Where are those guarantees that the United Nations needs to guarantee? It is obvious that the key institution of the world, which must ensure the coercion of any aggressor to peace, simply cannot work effectively. Now the world can see that what Russian military did in Bucha while keeping the city under their occupation, but the world has yet to see what they have done in other occupied cities and regions of our country. Geography might be different or various, but cruelty is the same, crimes are the same, and accountability must be inevitable. Ladies and gentlemen, I would like to remind you of Article 1, Chapter 1 of the UN Charter. What is the purpose of our organization? Its purpose is to maintain peace and make sure that peace is adhered to. And now the UN Charter is violated literally, starting with the Article 1. And if so, what is the point of all other articles? Today, as a result of Russia's actions in our country, in Ukraine, the most terrible war crimes of all times we see since the end of World War II, and they are being committed. Russian troops are deliberately destroying Ukrainian cities to ashes with artillery and airstrike. They are deliberately blocking cities, creating mass starvation. They deliberately shoot columns of civilians on the road trying to escape from the territory of hostilities. They even deliberately blow up shelters where civilians hide from airstrikes. They are deliberately creating conditions in the temporarily occupied territories so that as many civilians as possible are killed there. The massacre in our city of Bucha is only one, unfortunately, only one of many examples of what the occupiers have been doing on our land for the past 41 days. And there are many more cities, similar places where the world has yet to learn the full truth. Mariupol, Kharkiv, Chernobyl, Tyrka, Borodyanka, and dozens other Ukrainian communities. Each of them is similar to Bucha. I know, and you know perfectly well what the representatives of Russia will say in response to the accusations of these crimes. They have said that many times. The most significant was after the shooting down of the Malaysian Boeing over Donbass by Russian forces with Russian weapons, or during the war in Syria. They will blame everyone just to justify their own actions. They will say that there are various versions, different versions, and it is impossible to establish which one of those versions is true. They will even say that the bodies were of those killed were allegedly thrown away, and all videos are staged. But it is 2022 now. We have conclusive evidence, so there are satellite images. We can conduct full and transparent investigation. That is what we are interested in. Maximum access for journalists, maximum cooperation with international institutions, involvement of the International Criminal Court, complete truth and full accountability. I'm sure that every member state of the UN should be interested in this. For what? In order to punish once and for all those who consider themselves privileged and believe that they can get away with anything. So show all the other potential war criminals in the world how they will be punished. If the biggest one is punished, then everyone is punished. Why did Ukraine come to Ukraine? I will tell you, because Russia's leadership feels like colonizers. In ancient times, they need our wealth, our people. Russia has already deported hundreds of thousands of our citizens to their country. They abducted more than 2,000 children, just simply conducted those children and continue to do so. Russia wants to turn Ukraine into silent slaves. The Russian military are looting openly the cities and villages that they have captured. This is wide-scale looting. They are stealing everything, starting with food, ending with earrings, gold earrings that are pulled out and covered with blood. We are dealing with a state that is turning the veto into the UN Security Council into the right to die. This undermines the whole architecture of global security. It allows them to go unpunished. So they are destroying everything that they can. So if this continues, the countries will rely only on the power of their own arms to ensure their security, and not on international law, not rely on international institutions. The United Nations can be simply closed. Ladies and gentlemen, are you ready to close the UN? Do you think that the time of international law is gone? If your answer is no, then you need to act immediately. The UN Charter must be restored immediately. The UN system must be reformed immediately so that the veto is not the right to die, that there is a fair representation in the Security Council of all regions of the world. The aggressor must be brought to peace immediately. Determination is needed. The massacre from Syria to Somalia, from Afghanistan to Yemen and Libya, that should have been stopped a long time ago, to tell you the truth. If tyranny had at least once received such a response to the war it had waged, it would have ceased to exist, and honest peace had been guaranteed after it, and the world would have changed for sure. And then perhaps there would not be war in my country against our people, against Ukrainian people. against our citizens, but the world watched and did not want to see either the occupation of Crimea or the war against Georgia or taking the entire Transnistria from Moldova, and how Russia was preparing the basis for other conflicts and wars near their borders. How to stop it? Right away, the Russian military and those who gave them orders must be brought to justice immediately for war crimes in Ukraine. Anyone who has given criminal orders and carried out them by killing our people will be brought before the tribunal, which should be similar to the Nuremberg tribunals. I would like to remind Russian diplomats that like von Ribbentrop has not escaped punishment for crimes in World War II. I would also like to remind you that Adolf Eichmann also did not go unpunished. Nobody of them escaped the punishment. But the main thing is today it's time to transform the system, the United Nations. So therefore, I propose to convene a global conference, and we can do it here in peaceful Kyiv in order to determine how we are going to reform the world security system, how we will rely, how do we establish guarantee of recognition of borders and integrity of states and countries, how we will assert the rule of international law. It is now clear that the goals set in San Francisco in 1945 for the creation of a global security international organization have not been achieved, and it is impossible to achieve them without reforms. Therefore, we must do everything in our power to pass on to the next generation an effective UN with the ability to respond preventively to security challenges and thus guarantee peace, prevent aggression, and force aggressors to peace, have the determination and ability to punish if the principles of peace are violated. There can be no more exceptions or privileges. Everybody must be equal. All participants of international relations, regardless of economic strength, geographical area, and individual ambitions. The power of peace must become dominant. The power of justice and the security power, as humanity has always dreamed of it. Ukraine is ready to provide a platform for one of the main offices of the newly updated security system, similar to the Geneva office that deals with human rights, the Nairobi office that deals with environmental protection, and in Kyiv we can have U24 office that can specialize in preventive measures to maintain peace. I would like to remind you of our peaceful mission in Afghanistan. When we Ukrainians evacuated from that country over more than 1,000 people from at our own expense. It was a very difficult phase, and Ukraine came to their help. We took in people of different nationalities, ethnic groups, different faiths, Afghan citizens of European countries, US, Canada. We did not look who needed help. Was it one of our own or somebody else? We helped all of them. We saved everyone. If every time there was a need, everyone in the world would be confident that help would come, the world would be definitely safer. Therefore, Ukraine has the moral right to propose a reform of the world security system. We have proven that we helped others not only happy time, but in dark times too. And now we need decisions from the Security Council for peace in Ukraine. If you do not know how to make this decision, you can do two things. Either remove Russia as an aggressor and a source of war, so it cannot block decisions about its own aggression, its own war, and then do everything that we can do to establish peace. Or the other option is please show how we can reform or change, dissolve yourself and work for peace. Or if there is no alternative and no option, then the next option would be dissolve yourself altogether. And I know that you can admit that if there is nothing that you can do besides conversation, we need peace. Ukraine needs peace, Europe needs peace, and the world needs peace. And finally, I would kindly ask you very much to watch this short video. Please give us 1 more minute of your time, the video that we want to show that one country can violate rights, and that's the result of being unpunished. If possible, please watch this video, because it is impossible to get everyone to come to our country and see it with your own eyes. Therefore, I would ask you to watch this video. Thank you very much.
The video. They have the video. They have to. I'm not sure. The video, is it just coming?
Been uploaded to the technicians of the Security Council. So they have it in their possession.
We will sort that one out technically. We don't have the video. So I propose that while we sort that out, I thank His Excellency Mr. Zelensky for his compelling and powerful remarks. We will come back to the video when we've sorted out the technical issues around it. And may I say, speaking in my national capacity, may I express appreciation to the President for his leadership in wartime and for the extraordinary fortitude and bravery of the Ukrainian people under this unprovoked and illegal invasion. I resume my function as the President of the Security Council, and while we sort out the technical video, I propose to give the floor to those council members who wish to make statements. And I now give the floor to the representative of the United States.
Thank you, Madam President. Let me also start by thanking UAE and Ambassador Nisbeh for her successful presidency during the month of March. Madam President, as you begin your Security Council presidency, I want to thank the United Kingdom for your leadership and for organizing this vital discussion on Ukraine today. I also want to thank the Secretary General for his remarks and the other briefers. And I'd like to extend a warm welcome to President Zelensky. I was so moved by the address he made recently to our Congress, and we are truly honored by his presence here under the circumstances that he and Ukraine face today. Madam President, last night I returned from a trip to Moldova and Romania. I saw with my own eyes the refugee crisis caused by Russia's unconscionable war. I spoke to refugees who indicated to me their desires to return to their home. And we've all seen the images on TV of the bombed out buildings. But what we have not seen is that behind those destroyed buildings are destroyed lives and destroyed families. I met with women and children who had fled Ukraine, who stuffed their lives into backpacks and left the only home they had ever known. And these were sobering conversations. One young woman I spoke to came with her 6-year-old brother, who had autism and is struggling with cancer. Their single mother helped them escape to save their lives. But Russia's war has interrupted the care her brother desperately needs. Another woman I spoke to fled with her 8-year-old from Odessa. The father, who they'd left behind, told them there was shelling right next to their apartment that very night. And they very well could have died had they not left. A third woman I met told me that she used to love to travel, but never expected her next trip would be to flee for her life. When I asked her where she was from, she started to say, and then she stopped with tears in her eyes and said, "I'm sorry. I don't know how to say it, whether I live in Kyiv or whether I used to live in Kyiv." She was realizing in the moment just how dramatically her life had changed because of this senseless war. These are 3 stories of more than 10 million people, 6 million internally displaced, 4 million who have left Ukraine altogether, 4 million people who have relied on the big-heartedness of countries like Moldova, Romania, Poland, Slovakia, Hungary, and others across the region and the world to welcome and support all those leaving Ukraine in search of safety. Ukraine's neighbors are bearing the brunt of Europe's most significant refugee crisis since World War II. And I want these countries to know that they have a committed partner in the United States. And that is why the United States announced recently that we are prepared to provide more than $1 billion in new funding toward humanitarian assistance for those affected by Russia's war in Ukraine and its severe impact around the world. And it is why we are welcoming up to 100,000 Ukrainians and others fleeing Russia's aggression to the United States. We will continue to assist humanitarian efforts to help the people of Ukraine and all those fleeing Putin's violence. But as heart-wrenching as the stories are that I heard in Moldova and Romania, there are some stories we will never get to hear. Those of the people we saw in the images out of Bucha. We've all seen the gruesome photos. Lifeless bodies lying in the streets, apparently summarily executed, their hands tied behind their backs. As we work to independently confirm the events depicted in these images, I would remind this council that based on the currently available information, the United States has assessed that members of Russia's forces have committed war crimes in Ukraine. And even before seeing the images from Bucha, President Zelensky, along with others in the region, were reporting that children were being abducted, and we heard him say that today. Also abducted are mayors and doctors, religious leaders, journalists, and all who dare defy Russia's aggression. Some of them, according to credible reports, including by the Mariupol City Council, have been taken to so-called filtration camps, where Russian forces are reportedly making tens of thousands of Ukrainian citizens relocate to Russia. Reports indicate that Russian federal security agents are confiscating passports and IDs, taking away cell phones, and separating families from one another. I do not need to spell out what these so-called filtration camps are reminiscent of. It's chilling, and we cannot look away. Every day, we see more and more how little Russia respects human rights. And that is why I announced yesterday that the United States, in coordination with Ukraine and many other UN member states, will seek Russia's suspension from the UN Human Rights Council. Given the growing mountain of evidence, Russia should not have a position of authority in a body whose very purpose is to promote respect for human rights. Not only is this the height of hypocrisy, it is dangerous. Russia is using its membership on the Human Rights Council as a platform for propaganda to suggest Russia has a legitimate concern for human rights. In fact, we will hear some of that propaganda here today, I know. And I will not dignify these lies with a response, only to say that every lie we hear from the Russian representative is more evidence that they do not belong on the Human Rights Council. 140 UN member states voted to condemn Russia over its unprovoked war and the humanitarian crisis it has unleashed upon the people of Ukraine. Here's my message to all of you. Now is the time to match those words with action and show the world that we can work responsibly. And I share President Zelensky's view that this moment requires responsible world powers and global leaders to show some backbone and stand up to Russia's dangerous and unprovoked threat against Ukraine and the world. The Secretary General said that confronting this threat is the Security Council's charge. It is, and it is also the responsibility of UN leaders and leaders around the world, every single member state with a voice in the GA. No one can be a shield for Russia's aggression. Suspending Russia from the Human Rights Council is something we collectively have the power to do in the General Assembly. Our votes can make a real difference. Russia's participation on the Human Rights Council hurts the Council's credibility. It undermines the entire UN, and it is just plain wrong. Let us come together to do what is right and do right by the Ukrainian people. Let us take this step to help them to start to rebuild their lives. And let us match the courage of President Zelensky, who we are so honored to have with us today. President Zelensky, I want you to know that we stand with the people of Ukraine as you face down this brutal attack on your sovereignty, on your democracy, and on your freedom. Thank you.
I thank the representative of the United States for her statement, and I give the floor to the representative of Albania.
Thank you, Madam President. Let me thank Ambassador Nusibe for having steered our work during the month of March and wish the UK and you, Madam President, full success in our common work during this month. Albania welcomes President Zelensky's presence to this meeting. His remarks are painful, and his account on what Ukraine is experiencing under Russian occupation is revolting. We stand by you, Mr. President, by your compatriots, all Ukrainians, for their heroic resistance, for their resilience that the entire world is admiring. You are not alone. You have the world on your side, because it's the side of the right, of the just, and as we hope, of victory. Slava Ukraini. Madam President, let me thank SG Guterres for his, again, very clear and powerful remarks. I also thank USG DiCarlo and Griffiths for their updates. This is the 14th meeting of the Security Council on Ukraine since the 31st of January, while the war of aggression has entered the second month. Let's establish a few basic yet meaningful facts. Russia has stalled and its imperial dreams are nowhere. Taking Ukraine finally proved impossible. Kiev was too hard to swallow. Russian army is in disarray, but it has not stopped shelling and bombardments. But all this is not new, and all this is not news. The real news that has horrified the world is what Russia is leaving behind. The unspeakable horrors, those soul-crushing images in areas from which Russia is withdrawing. Images of civilians executed with a bullet in the neck, sometimes with their hands tied behind their backs or shot dead in their bicycles. Images of mass graves overflowing with corpses. Images of carnage and devastation, including looted homes, rape, and sexual violence, acts usually attributed only to thugs. They spring from the same cruel impulses as the bombardment of cities, homes, hospitals, schools, and kindergartens by the Russian forces. Bucha is an open-air graveyard, the notorious facelift of the Russian aggression. Madam President, we have heard time and again, it is not Russia. Yes, but no. It will be hard, actually impossible, to convince anyone that the destroyed tanks that clutter the roads, the mines and booby traps left behind amidst the wreckage, and the bodies of civilians killed by arbitrary executions and laying in the streets amidst debris are staged scenes for propaganda. Who would believe that Russia aggressed Ukraine simply to protect civilians, while Ukraine is busy staging horror movies? You may muzzle media back home, but you cannot fool satellite images. You cannot blind independent reporters and human rights NGOs on the ground. Waiting for Russia to accept and tell the truth is waiting for Godot to arrive, and he never does. These are facts, hard and sickening proof of the atrocities committed, the ugly face of this madness. Such crimes, as documented by Human Rights Watch and verified by independent and respected professional reporters, those who are banned for the Russians call for answers, call for thorough investigation, for effective accountability, for justice. Prime Minister Rama called these crimes a terrible pain and a horrible shame. Russia has an international obligation to abide by international humanitarian law, the laws of war, including the Geneva Conventions of 1949 and its first additional protocol. Russia has an obligation to abide by the order of ICJ to immediately halt its military activity in Ukraine. But unfortunately, Russia has made another choice, not to respect any of it, and has cancelled itself from international law. But the law will pursue it. Russian army and its commanders cannot escape accountability. The name of the butcher of Mariupol, a criminal that has reduced an entire city to ashes and has made its citizens go from 3 meals a day to barely 3 meals a week, is engraved in the ruins of the city. This is why we will support the call to suspend Russia's participation in the Human Rights Council. The UNGA resolution that created the Council stipulates that, and I quote, members of the Council will respect the highest standards in the promotion and protection of human rights. As we see, Russia's standards are nose-eating, and its presence there is a farce, a desecration of the place that is called to be the sanctuary of rights. Dear colleagues, Russia has announced that it will now shift its focus on eastern Ukraine. This means that it will concentrate its brutality there in what may end up becoming a war of attrition. Russia has blocked the renewal of the OSCE International Observer Mission in Ukraine. This denies the international community the independent eyes it needs there. This anticipates, sadly, more war, further atrocities, other crimes, even more humanitarian disasters. This war continues to particularly affect women and children. Millions have been displaced, many of them alone, in search of safety and security. It is heartbreaking to see mothers write names and addresses in the back of their children so that they are recognized in case they end up being orphans. We welcome the efforts of OCHA and its partners to deliver assistance in support of the people in Ukraine and the millions of refugees in neighboring countries. Madam President, let me end with this note. Rarely has the outcome of a war been so disastrously the complete opposite of what it wanted to achieve. Russia's army has been defeated by the outgunned and outnumbered Ukrainian resistance. Russia is isolated like never in its history. It has become the world's most sanctioned country in history. No country has ever seen itself transform in a matter of only 10 days from a global player into a financial and international pariah, to the point that it is obliged to find comfort in the support from North Korea and Syria. Dear colleagues, this aggression and its startling defeat have once and for all separated the fates of Ukrainians and Russians, because the case of Ukraine is also the cause of democracy against tyranny and kleptocracy. It is a fight between the will of the people against the vicious will of one whose reckless actions have challenged everything we stand for, and who is directly responsible for the economic disruption and food insecurity which is affecting the entire world. He may choose to stop, withdraw troops, and quit Ukraine, or continue to descend in the very abyss he has created and face the consequences. I thank you.
I thank the representative of Albania for his statement. I understand that we now have solved the technical problems, so I suggest we return to the video. Thank you.
Je voudrais d'abord exprimer mon appréciation à l'ambassadeur des Émirats arabes unis pour sa présidence remarquable. Je remercie le secrétaire général, M. Antonio Guterres, la secrétaire générale adjointe, Mme Rosemary DiCarlo, ainsi que M. Martin Griffith pour leurs exposés respectifs. Je salue la participation à cette réunion du président Zelensky. Madame la Présidente, nous continuons d'assister impuissants à la guerre en Ukraine. Pendant que se déroule le décompte macabre des morts et des personnes déplacées, et que les combats se poursuivent au même rythme que la courbe des statistiques de pertes en hommes et en infrastructures civiles ne cesse de s'accroître. Un jour de guerre est décidément un jour de trop. Alors que le conflit est dans sa 6e semaine, le nombre de personnes déplacées dépasse à présent les 10 millions, dont près de 4 millions de réfugiés dans les pays voisins. Il s'agit d'une catastrophe humanitaire effroyable, dont les répercussions seront sans doute aggravées par les risques d'insécurité alimentaire dus à l'imprévisibilité des récoltes, avec là aussi des effets transrégionaux. Je voudrais à cet égard saluer la mise en place par le secrétaire général d'un groupe de travail sur l'alimentation, l'énergie et les finances pour réduire l'impact de la guerre. Madame la Présidente, les allégations concernant des violences, notamment sexuelles, contre les femmes, sont un sujet de très grande préoccupation. Mon pays est très préoccupé également par les attaques contre les infrastructures et les personnels humanitaires. Les travailleurs humanitaires qui s'activent sur les lieux de combat ne doivent jamais être la cible d'attaques armées. Ces derniers sont bien souvent le lien qui maintient les victimes de la guerre avec ce qui reste d'humanité lorsque les fondements sont renversés. Ces derniers doivent pouvoir acheminer l'aide humanitaire dans tous les lieux où elle est nécessaire, sans entrave et dans des conditions de sécurité garanties par toutes les parties. Des convois d'évacuation sécurisés doivent pouvoir être édifiés pour permettre le bon déroulement des évacuations des personnes qui souhaitent quitter les zones de combat. Il s'agit d'une aide vitale pour les quelques 18 millions de personnes en besoin d'aide humanitaire en Ukraine. La situation à Mariupol, pour ne citer que cette ville, devient proprement intenable. La détérioration exponentielle des conditions de vie, voire de survie dans certaines localités, est très préoccupante. Plus encore lorsque les infrastructures civiles et la fourniture de services publics indispensables sont touchées. Nous sommes préoccupés par les risques de maladies résultant de pénuries d'eau dans certaines localités du pays, mais aussi des risques sanitaires découlant du manque d'accès à des soins de santé primaires ou spécialisés. Les femmes, les enfants, les personnes âgées et tous ceux qui ne prennent pas part aux hostilités doivent pouvoir être secourus à tous les points de vue sans craindre pour leur vie. Madame la Présidente, la guerre est une horreur, une rupture à tout point de vue avec ce qui, en tant qu'humains, nous lie les uns aux autres. C'est pour tenter de réduire les effets de cette rupture que le droit international humanitaire existe, pour ne pas laisser libre cours à l'expression de la force, en fait pour suppléer aux moyens du droit à la rupture du contrat humain. Toutes les parties doivent le respecter. Concernant les informations persistantes faisant état de massacres, d'exécutions sommaires, d'atrocités et autres crimes de masse visant les civils à Boucha, il est urgent qu'une enquête libre et indépendante, sous la houlette des Nations Unies, soit commanditée dans les meilleurs délais pour faire toute la lumière sur les victimes et sur les circonstances de ces exactions. Dans l'intervalle, il est primordial que ce Conseil ne perde pas de vue son rôle, celui de travailler à ramener la paix et la sécurité en offrant une alternative à la guerre. Le retour à la paix en Ukraine ne se fera pas par des échanges d'invectives. Madame la Présidente, cette guerre a assez duré et ses effets se font déjà sentir au-delà des frontières de l'Ukraine. De notre point de vue, l'équation se pose en termes de décision sur la mise en place d'un cessez-le-feu et sur la création des conditions d'un déploiement sûr et sans entrave de l'aide humanitaire nécessaire aux populations qui sont dans la détresse. Je voudrais réitérer l'appréciation de mon pays en direction des pays voisins de l'Ukraine qui continuent de se mobiliser pour l'accueil d'urgence des réfugiés. Nous les encourageons à accorder le même accueil à toutes les personnes en détresse sans distinction d'origine ou de race, y compris les ressortissants et étudiants africains. Nous demandons le respect de leur dignité et appelons à un traitement équitable de toutes les personnes en détresse. Il est urgent que les parties s'engagent résolument dans le temps de la négociation en vue d'un arrêt des hostilités. Nous appelons pour cela à la désescalade et à l'arrêt des combats. Il n'y a pas d'autre issue possible. Mon pays est attentif aux négociations qui se poursuivent actuellement entre les parties, notamment à Istanbul, et espère qu'elles aboutiront à court terme à un cessez-le-feu, afin de créer le climat de confiance et de mettre en place l'accalmie nécessaire pour que la diplomatie donne de la voix et que les armes se taisent. Je vous remercie.
I thank the representative of Gabon for her statement, and I now give the floor to the representative of the Russian Federation.
Благодарю вас, госпожа председатель. Хотели бы прежде всего выразить признательность и благодарность делегации Объединенных Арабских Эмиратов за их председательство в марте. Благодарим генерального секретаря ООН Розмари Ди Карло и Мартина Гриффитса за их брифинги. Выслушали президента Украины Владимира Зеленского. Хотим поблагодарить Мартина Гриффитса за его визит в Москву, в ходе которого, насколько мы можем судить, у него состоялись полезные встречи и обсуждения. Ему лучше, чем кому-то ни было известно, какие усилия Россия каждый день прилагает для организации гуманитарных коридоров. Однако свои обязательства, даже в рамках достигнутых с помощью международных посредников схем, целенаправленно не выполняет именно украинская сторона. Я не буду вас перегружать цифрами. Подробные сводки ежедневно публикует наше Министерство обороны. Отмечу лишь, что только из Мариуполя в восточном направлении, без какого-либо участия украинской стороны, нам удалось уже спасти 123,5 тысячи человек. В общей же сложности с начала специальной военной операции в Россию эвакуировано уже свыше 620 тысяч человек, из них более 122 тысяч детей. И речь не идет о каком-либо принуждении или похищении, как это любят представлять наши западные партнеры. О добровольном решении этих людей свидетельствует множество видеороликов, доступных в социальных сетях. Госпожа председатель, сегодня была заявлена другая тема встречи, которая практически не обсуждается, поэтому я опущу эту часть и хочу воспользоваться виртуальным участием в нашем заседании президента Украины и обратиться непосредственно к нему. Мы оставляем на вашей совести бездоказательные и огульные обвинения в адрес российских военнослужащих, которые не подтверждаются никакими свидетельствами очевидцев. Мы об этом вчера подробно говорили на пресс-конференции. Владимир Александрович, мы все хорошо помним, как в 2019 году вы были избраны президентом Украины. С вашим избранием было связано много надежд, ведь вы шли на выборы с обещанием мира, окончания войны на Донбассе. В вас поверило русскоязычное население, права которого вы обязались защищать. Казалось, вот и та историческая несправедливость, когда после майданного переворота в 2014 году Украину стали превращать в злобную антироссию, идет в историю. Но этим надеждам не суждено было сбыться. И вот вы уже презрительно называете жителей Донецкой и Луганской народных республик особами. Вторя вашему предшественнику, который грозил, что дети дончан и луганчан будут гнить в подвалах. Вы призываете их уезжать в Россию. И вот вы уже ополчились на родной для вас русский язык, вводя, по сути, языковую инквизицию в стране, где русский является родным для как минимум 40% населения. А сегодня взрывы и снаряды звучат почти по всей территории, на всей территории Украины, не только на востоке, где они не смолкали 8 лет. И звучат они именно потому, что другого способа принести мир на Донбасс, к сожалению, не осталось. После того, как вы и ваши подчиненные категорически отказались выполнять Минские соглашения, приготовившись при этом уже в марте решить проблему Донбасса военным путем. В ходе нашей спецоперации мы нашли множество соответствующих секретных приказов. Нам говорят, что на Украине не может быть нацистов. Однако мы прекрасно знаем, что они у вас не только есть, но, к сожалению, правят бал. Да и как может быть иначе, если национальными героями Украины являются нацистские пособники Бандера и Шухевич, ответственные не только за Холокост, но и за убийство сотен тысяч мирных поляков, русских, украинцев и евреев. Вы просто предпочли не замечать украинских неонацистов, делая вид, что их попросту нет. А они, к сожалению, есть, и их, к еще большему сожалению, очень много, а среди них много молодых. Откуда мы это знаем? Да они этого не скрывают, делают нацистские татуировки, украшают одежду свастиками и другими нацистскими символами, приветствуют друг друга как нацисты, не скрываются в соцсетях. Их особенно много в составе национальных батальонов, таких как Айдар, Правый сектор и Азов. И это было бы ладно, но они еще и действуют как нацисты, и убивают как они. Причем не только пленных российских солдат, мучениями которых потом бахвалятся в интернете, но и своих же. Ваши неонацисты и радикалы отличаются беспримерной жестокостью к мирному населению, который они используют в качестве живого щита и устанавливают рядом с жилыми домами тяжелую артиллерию и РСЗО. Мы сегодня опять слышали огромное количество лжи о российских военнослужащих. У нас есть сотни, если не тысячи видеосвидетельств людей, которые готовы дать показания о жестокостях украинских националистов. Зачитаю здесь лишь некоторые из них. Это жестокие истории, но вы должны их услышать. Наталья Кудинова, мэр города, сбежал одним из первых, а затем украинская власть врала, что Россия не пропускает людей по гуманитарным коридорам. Женщин с детьми нас батальон Азов под страхом смерти удерживал в подвалах и грабил на блокпостах мирных жителей. Бабушка с внучками рассказывала, как батальон Азов не давал выйти из подвала, и кто сделал шаг вперед, стрелял на поражение. На блокпосту Азова девушек и женщин раздевали догола и забирали золото и деньги, включая последние. Валентина Николаевна Борисенкова рассказывает, как украинские военные выгнали из частного дома на улице Краматорская женщину с 2 детьми и стреляли оттуда из миномета. Она со слезами на глазах ушла, выгнали из собственного дома ее. 2 деток у нее, выгнали хлопцы, повязки голубые у них. Это украинские опознавательные знаки. Марина Васильевна рассказывала, как ее пытали в подвале СБУ в Краматорске. Пристегнули меня в канализационной трубе. Когда узнали, что я русская, били, пытали электротоком, насиловали, угрожали привести несовершеннолетнюю дочь и с ней сделать то же. Шиповалова Ольга Георгиевна. Выехали из Мариуполя, из Мангуша уже 25 марта. Огневые точки ВСУ стояли между домами и во дворах школ, прикрываясь мирными жителями. По кварталу вокруг драмтеатра ездил украинский танк и производил беспорядочные выстрелы. Стрельба велась по жилым домам. На территории 69-й, 68-й, 5-й школы стояли танки. Видела своими глазами. Супорткина Ольга Сергеевна, школа номер 15 Мариуполя. С 25 февраля ВСУ заняли там свои позиции и уехали оттуда 7 марта. Стрельбу оттуда производили. Наш дом пострадал от обстрелов. 8-9 марта были очень сильные обстрелы, и именно целенаправленно было по домам. Украинских военных спросили, зачем они это делают. Ответили, что пока весь русский дух не уничтожат, будут находиться там. Мародерство с их стороны началось сразу. Разграбили все магазины. Эвакуироваться нам помогли войска ДНР, довезли нас до Мангуша. Есть еще множество душераздирающих историй. Есть до смерти замученные русские и украинцы с выжженными свастиками на груди. Есть убитые мародерами и преступниками, которым раздали оружие, мирные граждане и иностранцы, гибель которых руководство Украины, вопреки фактам и здравому смыслу, пытается свалить на российских военных. И я говорил об этом и еще раз скажу. Это подлость. Это подлость думать о том, что российские военнослужащие способны на то, в чем их обвиняют. А теперь еще есть и откровенные преступные постановки с мирными украинцами, убитыми своими же радикалами, с тем, чтобы в лучших геббельсовских традициях обвинить в их смерти российскую армию. Убиты в тех районах, которые российские войска оставили после обнадеживших многих мирных переговоров в Стамбуле. Теперь выясняется, что зря оставили. Я говорю прежде всего о Буче. Я понимаю, вы видели трупы, слышали рассказы, но увидели только то, что вам хотели показать. Вы не можете не видеть вопиющих нестыковок в той версии событий, которые продвигают украинские и западные СМИ. И то, что трупов в городе не было сразу после ухода российских войск, о чем свидетельствует сразу несколько видеосъемок. И то, что есть записи, где украинские радикалы призывают стрелять по тем, у кого белые повязки, то есть по мирным гражданам. Если вы смотрели внимательно видео, которое сегодня нам показывали, вы бы заметили, что на тех людях, которые лежат на земле, есть белые повязки, это мирные граждане. И то, что трупы на видео никак не похожи на те, которые пролежали на улице 3-4 дня. А по сенсационным и абсолютно антинаучным данным Нью-Йорк Таймс вообще с 20 марта. Повестись на этот фейк могут либо абсолютные дилетанты, либо наши западные партнеры, которые ничего не хотят слушать и давно уже называют черное белым и наоборот. К сожалению, этим странам на саму Украину наплевать. Она для них была и есть всего лишь пешка в геополитической игре против России, которой они легко пожертвуют. Но пока постараются продлить этот конфликт, поставляя туда побольше оружия и боеприпасов. Но самое главное, повторю еще раз, как мы докатились до той жестокости, которую проявляют националисты, например, из Азова. А вы, в данном случае обращаюсь к президенту Украины, в интервью американским СМИ стыдливо защищаете, говоря, что они такие, как есть. Хочу, чтобы вы задумались и очень надеюсь, что вы найдете решение этой ситуации, потому что оно зависит только от вас. Потому что мы пришли к вам не из-за украинских земель. Мы пришли, чтобы принести долгожданный мир на истекавшую кровью Донбасс. Не перемирие, а именно настоящий прочный мир. А для этого надо искоренить ту жестокость, о которой говорит. Вырезать ту нацистскую раковую опухоль, которая, пожирая Украину, со временем начала бы пожирать и Россию. И мы добьемся этой цели, надеюсь, скорее, чем позже. Другого выхода быть не может. Мы не бьем по гражданским объектам, чтобы сберечь как можно больше мирных жителей. Потому и продвигаемся не так быстро, как многие ожидали. Мы не действуем так, как американцы и их союзники действовали в Ираке и Сирии, стиравшие с лица земли целые города. Им их было не жалко, а нам жалко, потому что это близкие нам люди. Вот радикалам, правда, нечего терять. Им наплевать на мирных жителей. Они готовы утянуть за собой могилу хоть все население Украины, как это четко показала провокация в Буче. Не дайте Западу реализовать свои планы, Владимир Александрович. Примите правильное решение, необходимое для вашей страны, потому что Запад готов сражаться на Украине до последнего украинца. Примите это решение сейчас. Ведь реальную ситуацию на фронте вы прекрасно знаете. Потом может быть поздно. Благодарю вас.
I thank the representative of the Russian Federation for his statement, and I now give the floor to the representative of Ireland.
Thank you very much, Madam President. And I'd also like to thank the Secretary-General and our other briefers this morning. I want to express a very warm welcome to President Zelensky being with us this morning. President Zelensky, your courage, your leadership, and the courage of the Ukrainian people are an example to all of us. Secretary-General, on the 24th of February, as Russia launched a large-scale invasion of its neighbour Ukraine, you told the world that Russia's action was wrong, that it was against the Charter, that it was unacceptable. We agreed with you. However, you also told us that this invasion was reversible and called on President Putin to end this war to save innocent lives. We echoed those calls. Sadly, 40 days later, our call has been left unanswered. Instead, over the last 40 days, we have witnessed unprecedented levels of destruction and human suffering. We are watching cities pounded by Russian artillery. We are seeing millions forced to flee their homes, seeking refuge from Russian aggression. Just minutes ago, here in this chamber, we have seen the utterly shocking images of civilians lying dead in the streets of Bucha and elsewhere in Ukraine. Some, we know, are piled into improvised mass graves. Simply harrowing. So many innocent lives lost on our watch. as our pleas for peace go unheeded. The attempts here today to deny Russian culpability are frankly appalling in their cynicism, and I see them as an insult to the memory of those slaughtered civilians. Madam President, we roundly condemn the atrocities reportedly committed by the Russian armed forces in a number of occupied Ukrainian towns. The images from Bucha and other towns in the Kyiv region liberated by Ukrainian forces are horrifying. We here cannot suspend our humanity. Our thoughts, first and foremost, must be with the families of those killed. Their pain at the loss of their loved ones in such an unspeakable manner is almost unimaginable. Let's be clear. The Russian authorities are responsible for these atrocities committed while they had effective control of the area. The Russian authorities are subject to the international law of occupation. There can never be impunity from such crimes. Never, ever. Not in Bucha, not in any other town or village, ever. Where crimes have been committed, they must be fully investigated and evidence preserved so that these crimes can be prosecuted by domestic and international courts, including the International Criminal Court. Ireland will continue to support efforts to ensure robust and independent investigation of all violations of international law. We must have accountability and justice for the victims and for the survivors of this war. We at this table share that responsibility in face of such atrocity. We call on the Russian Federation to abide by the order of the International Court of Justice and to immediately cease its military action and withdraw from the entire territory of Ukraine. Madam President, in the last 40 days, we have seen a horrific humanitarian disaster unfold in Ukraine because of the Russian Federation's unprovoked and unjustifiable further invasion of that country. A country where just weeks ago, citizens lived in relative peace and prosperity, and one which has been transformed now into one where families lack access to basic necessities, where basements have become bomb shelters, where millions have become IDPs and refugees. The use of explosive weapons in populated areas has had a devastating impact on civilians in the midst of active hostilities. Once again, we call for the parties to the conflict to comply with international humanitarian law, including the obligation to direct attacks only against military objectives, the prohibitions against indiscriminate and disproportionate attacks, and the obligation to take all feasible precautions in attack. We have heard increasing allegations of sexual violence by Russian soldiers. You referred to this morning, Secretary General. We must stress that conflict-related sexual violence can constitute a war crime. The perpetrators of such crimes must be accountable. They must be held accountable. They will be held accountable. Sexual violence is another abhorrent crime of this war that cannot go unanswered. We again reiterate the need for full, safe, and unhindered humanitarian access to those in need, as called for today by Martin Griffiths. Secretary General, we again echo your call for Russia to implement an immediate humanitarian ceasefire. It is the very least the aggressor can do. It is way past time. As we know, the reverberations of this war are reaching far beyond Ukraine. It's unacceptable that Russia's war of choice against Ukraine is also having, and will continue to have, significant spillover effects across the globe. Deterioration of food security, surging energy prices, increasing poverty. The most vulnerable and impoverished in developing countries will suffer the most. We utterly reject that. Madam President, it is our collective responsibility here at this table to maintain international peace and security. nothing less. This is why we call on the Russian Federation to stop this war, to stop its unlawful attempts to establish occupying authorities, to stop destabilizing the democratic foundations of the Ukrainian state. Such steps are yet further reprehensible violations of Ukraine's independence, sovereignty, and territorial integrity. It gets harder each time to say this, but it is never too late to do the right thing and to end this war now. Thank you, Madam President.
I thank the representative of Ireland for her statement, and I now give the floor to the representative of Brazil.
Thank you, Madam President. Let me start by thanking Ambassador Nusseibeh, along with her team at the UAE mission, for competently navigating the work of the Security Council in March. I welcome His Excellency, Mr. Volodymyr Zelensky, President of Ukraine, in the Council today. I would like to thank the Secretary General, Antonio Guterres, and the Secretary General for Political Affairs, Rosemary DiCarlo, and Under Secretary General for Humanitarian Affairs, Martin Griffiths, for their updated presentations about the situation in Ukraine. Madam President, as we enter into the 6th week of hostilities in the Ukrainian territory, we continue to witness appalling images of human suffering. The recent reports of acts of violence against civilians in Bucha, Irpin, Kharkiv, Donetsk, and other places affected by the conflict are extremely worrying, according to the statement by the ICRC. We call for a really independent and thorough investigation of all reported violations with the full cooperation of both parties to the conflict, without prejudging any conclusions, and underscore the need for perpetrators to be held accountable. The international community is witnessing for too long appalling scenes of destruction of once peaceful cities, with shocking images from the conflict and the desperation of thousands of civilians trapped in the battlefield, with no food, no water, and no electricity. Once again, we renew our pleas for a broad, effective, and immediate cessation of hostilities in Ukraine. Only after the silence of the guns and the withdrawal of troops are achieved will it be possible to halt the immense costs of human suffering this conflict has brought. Madam President, the General Assembly has recently adopted a resolution on the humanitarian situation in Ukraine. As we said on that occasion, the General Assembly could not become a bystander of the shocking consequences of the conflict. And, as we added last week in this chamber, neither can the Security Council. As the main UN organ with primary responsibility for the maintenance of international peace and security, the Security Council has the mandate and the responsibility to address this situation in an effective manner. Nevertheless, our assessment is that the Security Council is failing in its role to help in supporting efforts to foster a constructive dialogue between the parties, with the aim of brokering an effective peace settlement to this conflict. We deeply regret that the Security Council has not been able to speak with one voice throughout the crisis. Promoting compliance with international humanitarian law, protecting civilians, calling for peace. These are objectives that should unite rather than divide us. We should strive to create the conditions for, on the one hand, invigorating the political negotiations, and, on the other, reaching an understanding on practical measures to minimize human suffering in Ukraine. Civilians wishing to flee the hostilities must be able to do so in safety, and those who decide to stay cannot become targets of attacks. In the same vein, parties must grant safe passage to relief consignments to those in need. Once again, Brazil reiterates the call for all parties to fully respect and ensure respect for international humanitarian law. The causes of conflict, whatever they are, do not undermine the obligations of all parties have to guarantee that civilians should be protected, that the wounded receive medical care, that humanitarian assistance reach those in need, and that detainees be treated humanely in all circumstances. There must be no politicization of humanitarian actions, nor selective application of international humanitarian law. Also, geopolitical objectives must not supersede the endeavor for peace, nor prolong the human suffering caused by war. Madam President, this conflict and its associated sanctions, apart from the enormous human suffering and devastation caused in Ukraine, is having spillover effects in the entire world, especially through increased prices of oil, gas, grains, and fertilizers, among others. Food insecurity has become an even greater threat to the world's poorest people, above all in developing countries. The longer this conflict persists, the higher the risk of further instability, hunger, and devastation in Ukraine and around the world. It is high time to return to the path of dialogue and diplomacy for a peaceful settlement of the conflict. We urgently need the cessation of hostilities. De-escalation of tensions and negotiations are the only way out of this conflict, not only for the countries directly involved, but also for the entire world. I thank you, Madam President.
I thank the representative of Brazil for his remarks, and I now give the floor to the representative of Kenya.
Thank you, Madam President.